everyone! As you all know, in this module we're talking about learning theories. And I wanted to start off with this because I know learning theories can be a little bit intimidating when you're first starting off in this program. I know I was definitely freaking out when I first started here. Another reason why I wanted to cover this is that I've noticed in teaching other classes that sometimes students conflate the educational moments in engaging minds as learning theories, when they're actually meant to be a way of organizing these different ideas and the evolution of modern schooling. So for example, in writing a teaching philosophy, because yes, other courses do this assignment too, I've seen students list things like democratic citizenship education as their influencing theory, and they cite engaging minds. But there's actually a lot of different theories and concepts that are contained within this moment. So I just wanted to make sure we touched on some learning theory before we really delve into our course text. But before we do that, I want to just quickly let you know what our tasks for this module are. Please ensure that you've completed Module 1, particularly reading the syllabus and watching the syllabus overview. This video has some pretty important information in it. Please also write a quick introduction and/or fill out my survey so I can create our MLC groups. And for this week, for your readings, you have some articles and videos. Once you've reviewed these, you can move on to the online activity for this week, which is creating a mind map based on the focused readings that you choose to do. And once I send you the information about your MLC group, please connect with one another. So you'll need to delegate the roles for each module, especially next week, and start deciding how and when you want to connect. So you may be asking, why is theory important to educational practice? Rachel, I want to be a nurse educator, not a researcher or a prof. Do I actually need to know this? Is this even relevant? And to that, I say yes. Theory isn't something just for academics, and is relevant to our practice as educators too. Such as, for example, when we feel lost and like we're just flying by the seat of our pants. We may feel like we need a set of guiding principles. For example, last fall I was asked to teach a class. I was asked on Wednesday night and my first class was that Friday morning, so I felt completely lost. So I turned to complexity science and adult learning theory to help me plan my classes. So learning theories give us that guiding set of principles to inform our teaching. Learning theories also help us understand what drives and impedes learning, and putting principles of learning theories into practice can improve our teaching. Now, there's a few different ways we can organize this discussion. Here, I'm going to be talking about this from more of a complexity science perspective, since that's the major learning theory that influences my practice. So I'm going to be pulling a lot on the work of Brent Davis from the University of Calgary. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he is the author of Engaging Minds. Since his work influences a lot of my research and educational practice. Specifically, I'm going to be using the idea of nested systems to frame this presentation. And he actually talks about nested systems in the fourth moment of Engaging Minds. I'm also going to show you quickly here how I've adapted this model for my own thesis to organize different learning theories that I'm using. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you some concrete examples of how complexity science has influenced my planning of this course. So here's a nested system. And this educational nested system diagram originates from within mathematics education. In the nested systems diagram, different systems or levels are shown as being nested within one another. So it's a series of concentric circles, with each circle representing a different level or system. And these systems dynamically interact with one another, and as learners we are enmeshed in many of these different systems. We can also influence these other systems. For example, we can shape our social groups just as they can shape us. Now, obviously things aren't this clear-cut in real life, and there can be a lot of different overlap between these different levels. This is just one way of organizing these ideas. We can also use this model to explore learning and knowing at each level, and this is how I've adapted this model for my own thesis, with complexity science providing an overall epistemological umbrella for justifying and mixing these different theories. These are some examples of how theory can be applied within our nested system. For example, Constructivism to understand individual learning. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of some of these theories here, specifically looking at the individual, interpersonal or collectives, community and systems levels. And for your focused readings, you'll have the opportunity to explore one of these in more depth. So for each of these levels, I've picked one very common learning theory that you will definitely be hearing about in your program. So for this presentation, we'll be talking about constructivism, social constructivism, communities of practice, and complexity science. Now, with each of these levels, there's a number of different learning theories that can fall under the individual level, such as mentalism, behaviorism, and constructivism. And as I said, I'm going to focus more on constructivism here just because this is probably the learning theory you'll hear about the most. But if you do choose to do the focused readings for this level, in Dr. McMurtry's Focusing on the Individual video, you will hear him talk about these other theories as well. So constructivism is usually associated with the work of Jean Piaget, and that's a picture of him over there. And he argued that learning should be compared to the growth of living organisms rather than mechanical metaphors such as those used in behaviorism and mentalism. So in short, constructivism is really about connecting new knowledge to pre-existing knowledge. Now, how is this done? Well, in constructivism, people are understood as learning by reorganizing their mental representation of the world, or schema, to adapt to their circumstances. So when a new experience is aligned with that existing schema they hold, it is assimilated into the schema. But when an existing schema doesn't fit their new experience, it needs to be changed. This is called accommodation. In constructivism, an individual's knowing is therefore a constructive construal of meaning. Learning and knowing is a matter of what fits with the individual's current physical and social experiences. It's not correspondence with some sort of objective truth that's out there. Now, what does this mean for us as teachers? Well, here the teacher is a facilitator rather than someone who just transmits knowledge to learners. In other words, learners' minds aren't just seen as an empty vessel that we need to pour knowledge into. The facilitator then sees learning as being based on previous experience and knowledge of our learners, and the facilitator supportively challenges and elaborates on learners' existing knowledge. So as educators, we need to pick teaching strategies that actively engage students in the learning process rather than assigning them a very passive role. So some food for thought. Do you think knowledge is really just a subjective, individual construction? Now we're going to switch things up and look at collectives or the interpersonal, and there are many theories that look at learning at the collective level, such as social-cultural theory, social constructivism, constructionism. We're going to be looking more at social constructivism here. So social constructivism shifts the focus from the individual to social processes. In this vein of thought, human knowledge is seen as being collectively produced. Thus, learning should be understood in terms of participation in social practice, such as language, work, which both enable and constrain our thinking. And Lev Vygotsky is an important name here. His work was on the social roots of learning. In short, individual knowledge originates in social interactions and then is internalized within the person. So while in constructivism knowing was constructed, Vygotsky would argue that it is co-constructed. So put simply, most mental functions start out between people before they become part of an individual's thinking. So learning happens socially before it then becomes internalized. A few important concepts here are zone of proximal development and scaffolding. So the actual development level is what someone can do right now, but the zone of proximal development is the range of tasks that are too difficult for the learner to master alone, but they can be learned with assistance. So what was once the zone of proximal development can become the actual development level. Scaffolding is, in short, a technique wherein the educator supports the learner. The level of support and guidance is adjusted, gradually reducing for each task to fit the learner's current performance level. And it's important to note that scaffolding doesn't necessarily have to be provided by a formal educator. It can even be a more advanced peer providing the scaffolding. So what does this all mean for educators? Well, we have to keep in mind that learning unfolds through social interaction and group practices. So you would want to pick the teaching strategies that would enable this. Other students should also be seen as resources for learning, which we can harness through our group work. We would also want to consider scaffolding within the zone of proximal development of our learner. So we don't want to aim our efforts below the zone of proximal development, but we also don't want to go way above it either. So while group work is important here, we do need to pay consideration to how to best structure group interactions and activities. So being a social constructivist teacher doesn't mean that we have a teacherless classroom. So some food for thought for this one. So if we're all socially constructed, how can we explain individual differences in the same group? And is knowledge really just a social construction? What about the physical world around us? So for the community level, we're talking about community of practice. And those of you in healthcare may have heard this one before because it does get adapted quite a bit in our field. So like social constructivism, community of practice, or COP, as you'll hear me calling it, sees learning as being a social process. So it does have quite a few similarities to social constructivism, but it is meaningfully different. So the focus here is very much on the social dynamics piece rather than what's just going on inside people's heads. And that's where COP theory differs from Vygotsky's social constructivism. While he was concerned about what social practices mean for individual learning, communities of practice remains focused on the social level of learning. So community of practice is a group of people who share an interest, a craft, and/or profession. The group can evolve naturally because of members' common interests in a particular domain or area, or it can be created specifically with the goal of gaining knowledge related to their field. It's through the process of sharing information and experience with the group that members learn from each other and have the opportunity to develop personally and professionally. So this idea of community of practice was first introduced by Lev and Wenger back in their 1991 book, Situated Learning. Community of practice is a social learning theory that understands learning and knowing as an active participation in complex social learning systems. Now, there's a few important core tenets of community practice in the above quote that I just want to highlight. So the first is that members of a COP share an interest, a craft, or profession. They can evolve naturally or they can be created to gain knowledge. And learning occurs through sharing information and experience. So here, learners attune themselves to social practices rather than taking in information. It also looks at learning outside of the classroom, such as in the workplace. So some key characteristics here are mutual engagement, joint enterprise, shared repertoire, and legitimate peripheral participation. So with mutual engagement, we're talking about individuals in the COP interacting with one another. Through this mutual engagement, they are able to create shared meanings. Members of a COP learn by sharing information and experience, particularly tacit knowledge. Joint enterprise is referring to whereby the group is working together towards a common goal. And over time, COPs develop and utilize a shared repertoire of knowledge, and this includes resources and jargon. So legitimate peripheral participation is when a novice in the community, let's say a first-year surgical resident, moves from the periphery of the community towards the center, so say I'm a more experienced orthopedic surgeon, by actively participating in some social practices, and their learning is occurring through their increasing level of participation within that community of practice. So as teachers, here we can see ourselves more as facilitators or leaders. And we should focus our attention on the social structures that education is taking place in. And this can include informal communities of practice that can exist even within the formal confines of our educational system. And there are some practical strategies that we can use here. So try to use real tasks where you can, rather than having make-work assignments. And keep the idea of legitimate peripheral participation in mind. Are learners getting to interact with more advanced and experienced practitioners? Are they moving towards more central participation in their community? So while communities of practice was developed as a learning theory, it often gets used as a management tool, and I have seen this quite a bit in healthcare. So as educators, how do we reconcile the tension between individuals' need for professional development versus the bottom line of our workplace? So now we move on to systems and complexity science, which is a theory that heavily influences my own educational research and practice. So complexity science seeks to describe the behavior of a complex adaptive system, or a CAS, as a whole and their interacting component parts. So CAS are these self-organizing systems, and they arise from this interaction of their component parts. And these systems cannot be taken apart to fully understand them, as you would with, say, a car or a watch. Some examples of CAS includes organ systems, the human body, societies, classrooms, and you. For those of you in healthcare, things like a primary care practice would also be considered a CAS. So as you can see here, you can't take these things apart to fully understand them. So for example, you can't take me apart and reduce me to my organ systems to understand me, because you will destroy the whole that these components are giving rise to. So I am more than the sum of my parts. Now, I've kind of alluded to this here, but let's talk a little bit more in depth about what I mean by arising from the interaction of their component parts. Well, these CAS come to be because of the interaction occurring between the agents or components that comprise them. So our class and what we can know in this course arises from the interaction between all of you. So in this regard, a CAS can belong to both smaller and larger systems. So for example, you yourself are a CAS that is comprised of microsystems like your organ systems, your immune system, and you also contribute to the emergence of macrosystems such as society, culture, our 5101 class. So you cannot be understood by just looking at your organs or your immune system, and likewise our class can't be understood by just looking at each individual learner in isolation. So complexity science talks more about knowing rather than knowledge, because what we can know is constantly changing. So here, knowing means something merely knows how to interact effectively with something else. But because these CAS co-evolve, or learn, with one another in their dynamic circumstances, knowing can only ever be provisional rather than about finalized truths. Complexity science also allows us to use the nested system model because it sees the different levels or systems as being nested within one another rather than being contradictory. So when selecting a learning theory, a complexity science considers which theory will best explain learning at that level. Now, complexity science doesn't really prescribe any sort of best practices for teaching, but there are a number of ways we can adapt this theory for our classrooms. So for example, considering diversity and redundancy, enabling constraints, neighboring interactions, and decentralized control. So what do I mean by these? So diversity involves harnessing the rich background experiences and education that our learners are bringing into our classroom, and redundancy ensures that our learners have some common ground so they can actually interact with one another. Diversity and redundancy are great principles to follow when you're designing group work, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment. Enabling constraints is another helpful concept. While we don't want our classes to be anything goes, because that would be complete and total chaos, we also don't want to be too structured because this doesn't leave much room for innovation and learning. So we need to provide some structure while also leaving room for innovation. So within our bodies, our organs need to work together to keep us alive, and this is neighboring interactions. So neighboring interactions allow students or learners to bump up against one another and interact because they need to be able to influence one another. And while perhaps this isn't as life or death in a classroom as it is with regards to our organ systems, it is still very important to learning. And decentralized control is the last one here. So as a teacher, we cannot control everything. Trying to do so will likely result in boredom or full-on rebellion from our learners. So it is better to engage our students in the unfolding of the classroom ideas and activities. Now you still need to ensure that the focus stays on the subject matter, maintaining boundaries and managing the classroom, but here the role of the teacher is more of a guide. So let's talk a little about diversity and redundancy. So within our class, when I'm creating the discussion groups, I'm going to be ensuring that there's diversity within each group. So we want to have some differences in experiences. We want to have different professions. So we don't want to have one group, say, of all nurses, because then that's not going to give you a lot of richness in your discussion. But in our MLC groups, we also want to have some redundancy or commonality amongst the group members. So some similar interests, similar backgrounds, similar work contexts, maybe career aspirations, something to bring the group together. So you can also foster this more generally through getting discussion groups to focus on a common reading and share their diverse ideas, which we are also doing in this course. Enabling constraints and neighboring interactions. So our assignments very much use the concept of enabling constraints. So while I do give some structure, like word count, due dates, so that you have this structure and are still meeting the learning objectives for the course, I don't dictate what aspects of your readings you need to write on, or what topics you need to choose for your assignments, for example. This can also be supported through general social interaction in your classroom, providing contrasting readings, etc. And decentralized control. So while I try to act as a guide for the class, I do involve my students in making decisions. In this regard, we are practicing decentralized control. So for example, allowing groups to pick their own supplementary resources for the MLC groups, allowing you to control your own group schedule, letting the discussant write the discussion questions rather than me giving you specific ones that you need to follow for that module. So these are just a few examples of how I've used complexity science to plan this course. And that's all for now, folks. Thanks for making it to the end. I hope this introduction to learning theories was helpful and made learning theories a little bit less intimidating. And hopefully you can also see some of the practical applications to your practice. Please let me know if you have any questions, because I know we've covered a lot of ground here. And always, I will see you all online.